Welcome to Think Orphan, the podcast for orphan excellence. Real talk with real people navigating the global orphan crisis.
Welcome back to the Think Orphan podcast. It's always such a pleasure to be able to have conversations with amazing people and really to get to talk with you out there, wherever you are listening. This really is a conversation with you. Brandon and I'm Phil Dark, your host, Brandon Stiver, who we're going to be able to hear from here in a minute. We just absolutely love having these amazing conversations with amazing people. And we have no doubt the work that you're doing is incredible out there as well. Hopefully what we're talking about today will help you, as it hopefully has in the past as well. If you haven't gone back and listened to those other episodes, please do. But Brandon, bring you in right now, man. How you doing?
I'm doing okay, man. I'm doing, we're starting to wrap up summer. It's just like, where has the summer gone? It's kind of crazy, but I'm doing okay. Got back from our summer travels. And, I don't think I've mentioned it on the podcast, but, living in East Africa for so long, you just figure like the wildlife and the insects are crazy. Washington State holds its own. They got crazier spiders here. And as I've unfortunately found out, pretty drug resistant fleas. So we got back from 2 weeks and found that fleas that we were trying to treat on our dog have planted eggs all in our carpet. Wow. So just the summer fumigation at the Stiver household. But other than that, we're doing okay.
Well, real life folks, we don't hold back here. As that's the constant, whether it was Kelly or, whether it was Karen or Rick, Brandon, me, consistently throughout. It's real life. We got things going on. The funny thing to me right now is with our kids going back to school, my kids are like, oh man, I gotta go back to school. Last year it was, can we please go back to school? Right. Sure. So it's all perspective. I was hoping they'd have that perspective again, going back to school. Like, okay, we get to go to school, but it quickly remember what it was like before, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
But hopefully
I hear you.
Yeah. Hopefully they'll have an amazing year. Be able to be in person the whole time, be able to connect with people, hopefully not have masks that much, because you know what, it's really hard to see other humans, and how we're reacting and learning. Seeing facial expressions is so important as we go on communication. So
mask or no mask, I know I'm looking forward to it. I feel like at the end of summer, we're always ready for our kids to go back to school. And after having them home so much more, I love my kids to death. I got 4 of them. They keep popping out. I don't know what's happening, but I am still nonetheless ready for them to go back to school, especially with how the last school year was. So, and I think my kids are ready too. So thank God for that.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
So folks, we haven't done this for a few episodes here, but we definitely would love for you to have, always, we do talk about this. We'd love for you to connect with us. info@thinkorphan.com. You can email me, Phil@providenceworld.com. And those are things we'd love to hear from you on. It's pdark@providenceworld.com. Sorry about that. But we'd love to hear from you on what you're learning, what you're struggling with, questions you have, people you'd love to hear on the podcast. We love to be able to engage with you and engage this conversation well beyond the podcast. The other thing we would love to have you do is rate and review the show. If you like this, if you've learned from it, first of all, share it with others, because that's really the number one way this show gets out there to others, is you sharing it with people that you think it will help. But also the rating and review it helps it get it out to other people. It helps people to be able to understand what this is all about and to hear it from people other than me and Brandon, just sharing it with them. So those are 2 ways that we can absolutely help to get this out to more people. And I know it's helped a lot of people so far, and I just thank the Lord for that. And hopefully it's helping you. And if it is, then hopefully you can help others as well. So with that, Brandon, who do we have today?
Well, today I'm really excited to welcome Pastor Evans Baggs from Port City Community Church in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I reached out to Pastor Evans after being introduced to him by our friends at Faith to Action in a recent webinar, one of the things that we're going to get into in this conversation is a report that Faith to Action did alongside Changing the Way We Care and the Barna Group. Of course, those of us evangelicals we're well familiar with the Barna Group, a leading research outfit that has really helped us understand a lot of different things when it comes to Christian culture, evangelical culture, or even just society at large. Just the utmost respect for the people over at Barna Group led by David Kinnaman. But Faith to Action recently did a study with them. And I got to hear from Pastor Evans, and we're just going to kind of learn a little bit about what does it look like for a missions pastor to and the church's piece, really, when it comes to global OVC care. We've been talking a bit more this season in particular around care reform. So, that's been something that they've even been thinking through as a church. And it's one of those pieces that is really critical. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Faith to Action study, but really also just get a clear view on what this actually looks like at the church level, from a guy that is an adoptive father and a pastor, a guy that loves his wife and kids and loves the congregation that he gets to serve and loves kids in the global South, and finding ways to support and bless them. So really excited to hear from Evans this morning.
Fantastic. Well, let's get to it. Evans, how are you doing? Welcome to the Think Orphan podcast. We are so excited to have you here with us today.
Oh man, it is a privilege to be here. Thank you guys so much for allowing me to come on the podcast with y'all.
Yeah. So one of the things I love about the way we do this now is you have no idea how we introduced you, but I know you can trust that Brandon did it justice, and he probably introduced you better than you would have introduced yourself. Because I know people right now, I have a feeling they're really excited to hear what you have to share with us, man. As am I. So, not to set it up too high. I mean, really, I think you're going to hit it and exceed the expectations right now. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. And really just, what we're talking about, what we talk with all our guests is, what is God doing in and through your life? How is God using you in the community that you're in? So hopefully it will be able to help others to work in the communities they're in, to help orphan and vulnerable children, to help all those that really come into their midst, to love them better and to love them well. So with that, can you just share, always one of my favorite parts of this show is hearing, people's story. Just really a little bit about you, your family, your story, and how you got to be where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Southeast Georgia with my mother and brother. We lived in a little town just outside of Savannah, Georgia, for pretty much my whole life. Went to school there. School had, 70 people in my graduating class, kind of one of those really small town feels. And and my life there, living with my mother and brother, was great. My father lived in Southwest Georgia, and we would go visit him. So, my parents were divorced, but we still had a great relationship and had good times seeing them. But didn't really grow up in the church as far as going to church or attending. My mother was so wonderful to try so hard to help my brother and I to follow the Lord on our own. But we kind of did a lot of our own things. My brother is definitely far more straight-laced than I was as a kid. So I got into a lot of mischief, so to speak. But by God's grace, way back in 2005, he, after I graduated college, was working in the golf industry. I went to a Bible study and really was confronted with who Jesus is. And so in that Bible study, it completely changed the whole way that I viewed who he was, who I thought he was. And for the next couple of years or so, got to spend a lot of time breaking down my thoughts, the things I felt, the things that I thought were true, and really rebuilding them. And so from that, I was able to, again, by his grace for sure, meet my wife and get married in 2009. And then we moved out to California, to San Francisco, where I went to seminary out there at Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary, which is now moved down to Southern California. But through those kind of relationships out in California was where things kind of really shifted as far as, what I was going to do. I was getting into ministry. I'd begun going to seminary, thought about working in the local church. and was really beginning to learn more about orphan care and orphan ministry specifically along those lines as well. Went to the CAFO Summit in 2012, and that was a very formative opportunity for us as a couple at the time. And so we always knew that we wanted to adopt personally as a family. And so we ended up going down that road in 2013, and we're in the process of adopting a child from Russia, and actually had gone over to Russia to St. Petersburg and met him. But that ended up being the same time. We went in 2012, and at the end of 2012, it was when there was an adoption ban placed on Americans in Russia. So we kind of got caught in that as one of the families. There's about 300 of us that had gone to Russia to visit the kiddo we were hoping to bring home, but unfortunately, we never got the chance to. And that was a pretty heartbreaking experience for us. But it taught us so much about God's love for just people in general, but the orphan, for the child that is vulnerable, and it crashes down a lot of the savior complex that we might have in life when God does something like that. And by His grace, again, we found out that the kiddo that we were actually going to adopt was adopted by a Russian family, which at the time was kind of unheard of. And praise God that he's with the family, and so we're very thankful for that. But we've had the privilege of adopting two other kiddos, both domestically. One in Sacramento is where he was born in 2013. And I know, Phil, it's a special place for you. And so we adopted him there, and then moved to Wilmington, North Carolina, where we are now, at the end of 2015, for me to take a position at Fort City Community Church, where I am now, where I oversee our mobilization efforts, kind of our missions efforts, global and local, as a church here too. And then during that time in 2016, we were able to adopt our second kiddo. He was born here, and man, it's been a whirlwind. So our kids are 7 and 4 right now, and we were with both of them when they were born, and very thankful to have been just used by God in that way to be their parents. And they're both boys, and they're both wild, but very thankful for them, and just kind of how God has used so many different things in our lives to put us where we are in Wilmington, North Carolina right now.
Yeah. That's so cool. I just hear all these different things that I can relate with. I mean, firsthand, we're still in the adoption process from China. We started in 2006 because we've never pulled out of it. But, the likelihood of that actually happening probably is not very, very high. We just kept having biological children, but we just feel God did not call us to do that. But to see how God does put us into certain things to introduce into our lives, things that we might not have otherwise ever thought about. And I really see that as absolute. And I see that in your story too. I've seen that in so many others' stories. And that's one of the things like I said, I love hearing that, because hopefully there's people listening who are needing to hear that, it doesn't always look how you want it to look. Boy, you know what? God's working. And hopefully, God, you're going to be able to see what God is showing you in the midst of these times, that in the middle of them, they're no fun, right? It's like,
right.
Why? Why, God? Right? With that Russia situation, it's like, what the heck? All this time we put into this energy, and this kid, now what? He's not going to get love. And then all of a sudden you see what the plan was, right? So amazing story. How cool is that? All right. So, the next thing, we love having you on. I love having pastors on to be able to talk about how God's working in you, in your church, through your church, to love the orphan and the vulnerable. And something, it often seems like an easy answer, like, oh yeah, of course it's a no-brainer, but it's really not a no-brainer. And it's something I want to talk about right now, which is, what do you feel as a pastor, as someone who has been more involved and getting more and more deeply involved in the orphan care, both personally and as a pastor, in caring for the orphan and the vulnerable. But what do you feel is the role of the American church in engaging the nations with gospel-centered ministries?
Yeah, I think God has given us so many resources, and that's people, that's obviously financial opportunities as well. And so the local church in America has been blessed in that way, beyond measure. So how do we take that to the nations? And that's kind of the thing, like, what is our role in that? And I think our role is to come in humbly, and also realizing that while we have the resources, we have all these people and all this stuff, most Christians don't live in America. They don't live here. So how can we, as a church who has the ability to maybe bring some some resources of education, some understanding and learning that we've had to the global church, and then allow them to be the ones to take the gospel into their areas, into their country, so that it doesn't have a, we're going to come do it, we're going to come lead it, it can't be that. Like, our hearts have to be humble, because we didn't do anything. It's just the way that God has just placed me here in this position and in this spot. And I think as a pastor, our role is to shepherd. Our role is to tend the sheep and shepherd God's sheep for him. And I take a great, I think, responsibility on how can I help shepherd the people that God has placed, really in my purview here at Port City. And there's a lot of folks that come to our church, and I'm the mobilization pastor, not the lead pastor, but that gives me the opportunity to help influence the lead pastor, to talk to him, to talk to the discipleship pastor, and bring these things that I'm learning about global orphan care to them, and help them leverage their influence as well throughout our church, because we can get stuck doing the same things over and over and over again, or we can really take a hard look at what is the American role. And I think it's got a ton of humility in that we've got to be able to leverage and use what God has given us humbly to take it to the nations, and then allow them to do the work of reaching their own people and caring for their own people, and how we support in that. It looks a lot different maybe than it did 10 years ago. I know it looks a lot different here than it did 10 years ago, and even partnering directly with local churches in other areas, and then being able to bring that out so that our people see that. We want them to be able to see that partnership is happening. It's not us going on a short-term mission, going to go do all this work. Man, we are going to partner with local churches and help them as they begin to reach their people with the gospel. They begin to care for their families as well. So I think that's a big role I think that we have to play here as the North American church, the Western church, how we want to look at it.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've talked a lot about with people, is just, what does it look like to have a humble learning posture anywhere, is what
Sure.
it is to have a humble learning posture everywhere. Right. So in our own backyard, it's the same as wherever we're going. And if in our own backyard, we're learning and taking a step back and going, I don't understand why I would be doing anything different otherwise. Right. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's that, so how can God teach us? And the stuff I've learned with that posture has been amazing. And if I would have gone in thinking I knew everything, I never would have seen them. So what do you think, Brandon?
No, I totally agree. I think that humility piece is absolutely critical. And one of the things that you mentioned there, Evans, I think is sometimes kind of overlooked, is that actually there's more Christians outside of the U.S. We're not necessarily really, especially now, we're not the center of what God's doing in the world. I living in Tanzania, you see so many faithful Christians that are just pouring their hearts out, and it's an opportunity not only for us to learn, but just to just be brothers and sisters, in a kingdom that goes far beyond the boundaries of this is the US and this is Kenya and this is, wherever. God's kingdom doesn't have those boundaries, and our affiliation and association with one another as believers is so much more important, so much stronger, so much more beautiful. So what you bring up there, as far as, there's more Christians out there, and we just need to figure out how to be brothers and sisters, is kind of how I see that. And, obviously you're familiar with the podcast, and, this is all about orphan and vulnerable children. And you, aside from, bringing permanency to your own kids and adopting them in, which is just such a beautiful expression of Romans 8, Galatians 3 and 4. You're also overseeing these global outreach initiatives at the church, which includes, ministries with orphan and vulnerable children. So you haven't, as you mentioned, you were in San Francisco at one point for a seminary, and then you came into your current role at Port City Community Church. What did that role look like when you first stepped in, as it pertains to orphans and vulnerable children and kind of the different ministries that you guys were connected to? What did it look like when you stepped in, several years ago? And then, how has your view, and then even the church's view, progressed over time when it comes to OVC work and ministries?
Yeah. So when I got on staff in January 2016, it looked vastly different. So our church ended up beginning a partnership with a local pastor in Kenya way back in 2002. And our church has only been around since 1999. So it was really something formative within our church. It's part of its DNA. And through the time frame from 2002 to when I came in 2016 and began to learn more about it, I mean, that was the thing that we did as a local church. We had a sponsorship program. We had built group homes, both secondary and primary group homes, and then had done many different opportunities working with street kids there, bringing them in, but anything and everything you can kind of think of in the process in between then too. But ultimately, when I got here, that's kind of where it was. And learning about the group home, I went to Kenya. That was the first thing they wanted me to do in April. So I've been on staff for 3 or 4 months, and went to Nakuru, Kenya, and was able to meet the pastor there and see the group home that we supported. And I think at the time I didn't know anything about anything. I was learning so much, and it was so much just coming at me. And I stepped foot there, and I remember walking around and seeing and thinking, what is exactly going on here? What is this? And so that was kind of the deep dive I needed to do to learn about it much deeper than kind of what I had coming in. Because I had a cursory knowledge coming in, and I knew some things I'd learned from some really good teachers before then, but then actually physically seeing it and then thinking, all right, well, this is now my responsibility to help shepherd our church in this. Is this the best thing that we should do? But again, we had a sponsorship program, 3 sponsors per kid. So that's a lot of folks. We had over 100 children there, and college children, and all these things that were going on with it. So it was a big deal. It was the deal of what we did as a church. And so I had to learn a lot about that. And man, over the past 4 years of working through that ministry and asking a lot of questions and making a ton of mistakes along the way, I just began to see more and more that we as a local church have this responsibility to do what you see God's plan of children and families. And that was the main thing. And that was not the process of what we had going on where we were. It was permanency in the group home, where they were being even adopted by some of the staff, but living there. And whether it was, a beautiful orphanage, because I've seen those, I've been to those group homes. You're like, oh man, they are incredible. Look how pretty they are. Look at all this stuff. It's still not home. And I think that was one of the things that really landed on me was how do we bring home into this? But we called it a home, but it wasn't a home. And so it was a hard, long kind of process that we've been going through for the past few years to transition away from that. And there were a lot of hurt feelings and a lot of that pain. But we just knew that this was the way we needed to go, and how could we do that as well as possible. And so that's kind of what we've been doing for the past 4 or 5 years, is just learning and trying to work with that organization there to see how we can bring more family care into it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's so good to kind of hear as you, stepping into your role, but was really kind of getting on the ground there to really kind of see what is this all about, and actually asking the good questions. Right. And that idea of home, I mean, I work for 1 million homes. So that's a very significant, concept for us as well. And one of the things that I thought about, there's group homes, congregate care, there's orphanages, there's institutions, and there could be nuances between these different, residential care, type of facilities. But one of the ones that we use regularly is referred as a children's home. That's a very common euphemism. This is a children's home. I used to work at a children's home, and it's an interesting kind of thought on your word, because where should kids ideally be growing up? It's not in a children's home, but in a parent's home, right. like my kids live in a parent's home because there's parents here. And as you kind of stepped into what was handed to you with this, legacy partnership in Kenya, you had to kind of kick the tires on that thing. And this is not uncommon. And one of the things that we definitely want to highlight, and you guys will find these links in the show notes for Think Orphan, but our friends at Faith to Action partnered with the Barna Group to do this study that really kind of highlighted people in the situation that you were in, right? Stepping in as pastor of this ministry, as a Christian, what is the role that we're playing when it comes to these residential care facilities? And I just wanted to kind of highlight a few things. And again, you guys are friends at Faith to Action. We've had Ellie on, we've had Sarah on before. So just fantastic work that Faith to Action initiative is doing. But this study, if you guys haven't seen it, there are some pretty striking kind of figures. The one that kind of jumps out. Now, you guys had a budget at your church that was devoted. You guys also had individuals that were giving directly through a sponsorship program. All of these things accumulate, right? And this is one church in North Carolina. It's a good sized church, but it's just one church.
Just one, right?
And the projected amount of donations from Christian individuals annually to support residential care, according to this study from Faith Action and Barna Group, is $3.3 billion annually. I mean, is really remarkable. I mean, when we think about big ministries like World Vision USA or Compassion International, you add both of those up together and they're not getting up to $3 billion. It's pretty remarkable. The projected number of Christians reporting to have gone on a trip to visit an orphanage or a children's home is 4 million. And when they have gone into those short-term mission trips, they are far more likely statistically, according to this study, to be long-term supporters. So it really is kind of an industry that's been developed around, people like Evans and the child sponsors from your guys' church. Mm-hmm. And for you guys, and for you as a leader within that, you recognized, hey, we really got to kind of test this out. And, we don't need to get into the details, of course, but there is this, when we are partnering, there is this piece around, hey, if we're partnering, there also needs to be accountability, right? So for you guys as church leaders, kind of testing this out, seeing what's the good, what's the bad, because there's always a mix, right? What does accountability look like between supporting churches like what you guys have been doing and these global ministries? And it doesn't even have to be orphanages. It could just be kind of more general than that. And is accountability, is it feasible? And if so, what does that look like? I mean, from your guys' experience.
Yeah, I mean, that's a main point of what we try to do with accountability here, because at the end of the day, if we as a local church have a missions budget and we're taking that money and we're giving it to organizations, I mean, we're managing God's money. It's all his. And B, that's money that people have given to us to steward on behalf of them. So we're working as the steward of their money. And man, we have to take that so seriously, personally, but even at the church I'm at too. And so that was part of the thing, was seeing the amount of money that we were sending over there and thinking, wow, are we doing the best even with our people and their hearts and what they do and what they think is good, but with their money. And so accountability financially is huge. And so we've definitely shifted into a position of accountability where we do partner with, obviously, nonprofits in the States that may work overseas, that may help overseas, organizations like World Orphans or Agape Children's Ministry, so that you have the financial accountability here in the US of a nonprofit status, so that we can see where the money goes. When they publish those reports are readily available. You have to be able to get them. And so being able to get those things are so important for us. So then we know exactly where the money's going. But we like to have, in our church, we'll have conversations with, oh man, I don't even know how often, probably 4 or 5 times, maybe 6 times a year with reps, and just kind of talking with them, the people that just I've gotten to know. And financial accountability is there, but also just relational accountability. How are you guys working? How are things going? It's kind of it's the same thing we do with our missionaries. When we send them overseas, we don't just leave them, and we also don't just allow them to give us a quarterly report or something like that. we want to actually talk to them. And so we have conversations every 6 to 8 weeks with our missionaries that are overseas. And so we do the similar thing with organizations to make sure that accountability is there, and that the local church, me even put in this place to manage our missions budget, and our vision for missions is actually making sure the money's going where we say it is. And if it's not, then we've got to be able to know, we've got to make those hard decisions. And, with our work in Kenya, it's not that money was being mismanaged. It was just, it was hard to have some accountability in that. And so when we began to kind of pull away and look at other organizations, we're like, no, one of the requirements we're going to have is we're going to have something with a U.S. nonprofit status that we know that will be held accountable by the United States, by our government, but also we have access to be able to hold them accountable as well. So, and again, that's just kind of the financial piece, and that's usually the first thing I'll think of when I think accountability. But mission drift is a very real thing, and making sure that we're staying on top of this. And not all churches are going to be like the church I'm in. I mean, I worked in a church in San Francisco. There was 3 of us, and I was the missions guy, but I was also the entire church finance guy, and the IT and HR and, youth ministry, kind of whatever hat the associate pastor and the lead pastor wanted me to wear on that day, which was fine. But understanding, like, I get that it can't happen. It may not happen as often because you may not have a person who has their eyes on these organizations all the time. Whereas in our church, like we do, that's my role. But it's finding the right people that can and who do want to in the church. If it's not a bigger church, who's on your missions team? Who are the people that can make sure that things are going in the right direction? So you don't lose sight of that, because it can get so easy, especially we just stay so busy in other realms, and most churches are not as big like this is that can have that many staff kind of put on one thing. But we've got to make sure that we're doing it. So I definitely think it's possible, and I think it's necessary. I mean, if we want to stand before the Lord and say, this is how we were accountable to our people, and this is what we did with your lambs, we're going to give that account. I think it's vitally important.
Absolutely.
That we're asking the hard questions.
Absolutely. And it makes me think even of, the parable that Jesus, shares about the talents, right?
Talents.
Well, what did you do with it? What did you do with it? And how do you actually know, what you did with it? And it's not our recommendations. It's not our recommendation section yet. But one thing, just for our listeners, for me as somebody that, oversees a community of practice of these different organizations, vetting organizations is something that is like so common for me and for you as well when you're looking at missions opportunities and global ministries to jump into. For me, it is also a lot easier. I agree when they have an American facing nonprofit. And one thing that everybody can do, there's these websites, GuideStar and Charity Navigator. You can go and check the 990 forms for organizations that you guys are involved with. And, as somebody that works for a nonprofit, that's a vulnerable thing for me to say. But at the same time, we actually need that transparency. We need that accountability. So I would actually recommend that people do exactly that, because we need to have that, especially for us as faith-based organizations, where ultimately it's not just about, if the donor is pleased. Really, it's about if God is pleased. And when you check those 990 forms on Charity Navigator or GuideStar, you can see, well, where did they put the money? Did they put the money into that program like they said they did? Or, you can check that kind of stuff. So it's really important to do that.
One thing I'd say on that too,
go ahead, Phil,
is to go beyond the GuideStar and Charity Navigator as well. So if you're really wanting to partner with a ministry, to understand what their success metrics are as well, because do their success metrics line up with yours? And, again, and I would say biblical, right? So when I say yours, hopefully that's biblical success metrics, right? Is it simply, the kids graduated from high school, therefore we're successful?
Right.
Or is it they understand the gospel? Is it that they, are leaders in their communities? Is it that they are building families? What is the success metric? Are they even measuring that? Right. Yeah. So those are things. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, Evans, as far as a church, are you doing that? How are you doing that? What does that look like? Because again, you don't want to say we're right, you're wrong. But at the same time, there are things that are critical to gospel ministry, that if the ministries are just simply going through motions or doing things to look good on an annual report or on GuideStar or on Charity Navigator, which can be done, and numbers can be manipulated to look a certain way. How are you able to, as a church, be able to do your homework without micromanaging organizations you're partnering with?
Yeah, every year when we're sitting down with organizations and kind of talking with them through it, we do where are we both headed, in this? What is the goal? So as an example with Agape Children's Ministry, when we started working with them, it was, okay, you guys are doing work in Kitale and Kisumu, Kenya, and that's great. And we want to see if we can come alongside that. But then where's the partnership going to go next? Well, they have an idea of working in Nakuru, Kenya. Well, that's pretty amazing because that's where we were and we want to stay in that area. So it gives us the accountability of me getting in touch with Chris Page on their staff and being in touch with him and saying, how are things going with Nakuru? So it's so relational. I think that someone on the staff of the organization, and that could be an American. It doesn't matter necessarily. It's just who's the right person that needs to be, whether they're in the office in the U.S., maybe more likely they're not. They're over there on the ground, kind of seeing what's going on a day-to-day basis. But I think that's been really helpful for us because we'll kind of set that out beginning of the year. So we're in budget season now. So we're looking at what are we going to do for 2022? Where's our money going to go? And that's having those conversations of, we have an allotment of money that we are going to spend and we'd like to spend, with an organization to support them, but it's knowing exactly what we're going to do with that money. So when we partner with church planting organizations among unreached people groups, we do that. And we know where the 5 church planters that we're going to support are going to be. And we want to get metrics from them. And those can be what they can be for different organizations, but we try to partner ones that will give us really good ones. And it's not like, well, we had 50 salvations or we planted 8 churches. It's more of like, how is the gospel going? How faithful are you being? The Lord's going to call people, and how faithful are you? So it's kind of the same thing with other organizations with vulnerable children and families. How are they being faithful with what they've been given? And whether or not they have these outrageous numbers, that's not necessarily the goal. That's what you want. Like, you want to see growth and all this change, but are they being faithful? And so ultimately, I think it's relationship. It's knowing the people that you're working with in a really trusted way. And by that, it's been really cool for me because I've become friends with so many of these folks that, these organizations we work with, they'll come visit and they'll stay at our house. They'll spend the night with my family. And like, that's a big deal for people that we've just met, maybe on a Zoom call or on a phone call, but we've gotten to know each other so well when they come here. It looks different. It is part of the family of God. So I think that's a big thing into accountability too, is knowing them.
Absolutely. I think that's critical. Absolutely critical.
Yeah. And I just think, even kind of what you were talking to as well, Phil, what you count counts. I know that's kind of a little cliche, but if people aren't monitoring what they're doing or what they're counting, you kind of just have to wonder, well, what's really being done. So anyways, one of the things that I heard you talk about, Evans, when you were in the Faith to Action webinar, and again, people, please go check out the study. One of the things that you mentioned was kind of this sense of lament over some of the past engagement. Now, again, we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of anything because we always want to honor and bless. But there was, as you had said earlier, where you guys are now is different than where you were in 2016, right? So there's been a 5-year period of kind of just some reevaluation, some changes, and wanting to make sure that you're getting behind God's, initial desire, which is for kids to be in family, wanting to make sure that there's accountability. All of these things have coursed a new path I don't know if I said that right. It's kind of driven a new path, a new course of action for you guys. But there's also that sense of lament over past engagement, for the church or for individuals. But at the same time, you have kind of a new sense of excitement for what the future missions will look like for the church, for you individually, for some of the people that had been sponsoring children and so forth. So can you just share a little bit about that contrast, that lament and that excitement, and what actually gives you hope for the church's role in global outreach?
Yeah, it's the lament thing is hard because we don't always want to sit and sit in that and lament over it. But I think as we do lament and say, man, we may have missed a few things here and there, we can always rely on the fact that God is sovereign over all of this. And there were good things that came out of what happened with the ministry that our church supports. It was not, that God was not in control, that he was still sovereign. And there were some wonderful people that did wonderful work through that. But you still lament because there were misses in there. And I think it's good to just sit there and say, man, we missed it, but Lord, thank you. Because part of that lament is just giving it back and saying, thank you for the fact that you are sovereign, you are good, and we can trust you. And then moving forward, I think it's really cool just seeing some of the traction that this is getting, this kind of movement, seeing different organizations, Faith to Action, Christian Alliance for Orphans, 1 Million Home. There's so many people that I think are seeing this, and getting that groundswell moving gives me a ton of hope, because the information is out there. It's just, we've got to help educate those of us one by one as God's kind of picking us off and showing us this stuff. How do we have to make sure that we're going to take it with us, because we've seen it, we've heard it. So now we're responsible to go to someone else with it. And so I think it's great that I have seen churches, and I'm getting the chance to talk to other churches and just give this view and stand on stage here. Like I actually got a chance to do it last week, and kind of in one of those announcement segments, and just give this vision for 800-900 people, for them to see like, oh, there's a different way that we can do this. So to me, it's exciting because I see this groundswell that's like coming along, and it's moving. And with COVID and the things that have happened there, the resets that ministries are taking, but also being very aware that there's so many orphans. The Lancet put out a study that had over 1.3 million orphans that have come from COVID, whether that's a double orphan or a single, but they've lost their primary caregiver or parent. Yeah. There's going to be a lot of people with good intentions that are going to want to run to start orphanages and build orphanages through that. And I think we as local church can say, thank you, but no, there's another way that we can come alongside. And there's good organizations that are out there doing this work. And then we can say, we're going to partner with them to see families try to, made whole again through this. And these children are not going to end up in institutional care.
Yeah. Amen. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there's, as usual, folks, there's so much good stuff that has been shared through this interview. I encourage you to go back, listen. But before you do that, even go back and go and check out that Barna study. Again, it will be in the show notes. Check it out, look through it, and then listen again with that in mind. And so you see kind of, this isn't just out of whole cloth. We're not just making this stuff up. I think you meant charting a new course there, Brandon, by the way, but we're charting a new path, but that's okay. You're coursing a new path.
My mind was thinking in Swahili. I don't know what to do. I can't turn it off.
Yeah. You can always use that excuse. That's not fair. I want to have that excuse. But and maybe you just coined a new term. Who knows? These are things that you have a different perspective than a lot of us do, right? I mean, and I think we're all looking at these issues from different perspectives, and that's so important in all of this. Mm-hmm. It's why Brandon and I are so huge on collaboration, and I know you are too, Evans, just from this conversation, right? Even talking about the relationships, to be in a relationship with somebody, then when they're doing things that are solid, when they're struggling, when maybe things aren't quite above board, because you're in relationship, as we are here in our communities here in the United States or wherever you live around the world. That when you're in relationship with people, you understand when they're hurting, you understand when they're thriving, and you can hopefully help them to, get out of those ruts and continue spurring them on to love and good deeds when they are thriving. So those are all things that I strongly encourage folks to go back and listen. But, we aren't done yet, though. That's the good news. This is always kind of bittersweet as we come close to the end to have these last couple questions. The sweet is we get to hear the answers. The bitter is we are almost done. But the last couple questions we ask everybody, and now we get to hear your answers. But the first is, what have you watched, read, or listened to that has impacted your thinking on how we can love orphan and vulnerable children with excellence?
Yeah, listen to. There's a really good podcast. It's called the Think Orphan podcast, and I would highly recommend that for people to listen to.
It's overrated. It's overrated.
I just want to come back. That's all it is.
That's all right.
Let me be on again. No, it really is good. I really have appreciated so much over the past few months and years, really listening to the podcast. But reading, you mentioned it earlier, but the Faith Action Initiative. It's research, and it's like their summary of faith-based research and things like that. So it's not necessarily a book, but oh my goodness, you start reading into the work that Faith Action has done and seeing how they've compiled this in ways that is digestible, and you can read it, you can understand it, you can see that it's studies that support this. That has been the number one thing that has shaped my view on this in the past few years, was seeing the fact that you kind of intuitively know it, that children belong in families, right? Like we know that, but most of what we've known is the orphanage model. Kids are on the street, bring them in an institution, let's keep them there. But where's the back end of that? How are we measuring what's happening to these kids? And in the back of our mind, we probably know, well, it's probably not great. I've been to orphanages in China and Russia, and I've seen from the kids as they've left some of the things that they've gone through. And I've heard from the caregivers and stuff. So reading things from Faith to Action that show what difference it can make in a kid's life and in a community's life when children are reunited with their biological family, or there's kinship care, there's foster care, there's so many different options when you're thinking globally that actually are more normal than we may think. But Faith to Action Initiative, I would encourage anyone to go on their website, look under their resources, and check out there's some summary of research, the continuum of care. Those sort of things helped us move forward into the ways that we knew we needed to as a church. And also one other one, the Christian Alliance for Orphans, their research center has got a lot of resources as well. And one of them that was particularly helpful for us, for me personally, it's called Guidelines for Healthy Sponsorship Programs. Mm-hmm. And it lays out what those should look like and what really good ones can, because they're going to still exist probably. And if they do, let's at least do them well and see where we're going to go. Maybe we transition, maybe we don't. But that was really helpful for me, because we knew that if we're going to have a sponsorship program, how are we going to do it well moving forward too? But then it talks about how do you transition donors out of that, and CAFO research does that as well. And so those are super helpful for me as I was really kind of immersing myself in this because I got it so much put on my front doorstep in 2016.
Yeah. Well, folks, that you point to something there. There's no shortage of really, really good resources out there. There are so many amazing resources, and hopefully we can get them into people's hands who need them. So definitely Faith Action, phenomenal stuff. CAFO is producing phenomenal stuff. We're Without Orphans, phenomenal stuff. There's so much out there. If you need help navigating that, Brandon is a great resource for that. I know that something that you can reach out to him, and 1 Million Home, they're connecting people with resources all over the world phenomenally, as are Faith Action and World Without Orphans and CAFO. And, I can connect you with people too. So those are things that don't sit there paralyzed and going, I don't have the stuff, because it's there. But sometimes it is paralyzing because there is so much of it. Yeah. And, but I do encourage you, definitely those couple things that Evan's talked about there are fantastic. There's a lot there. So if you need to even go into those websites, a little bit of help navigating, there's people who can help you do that. So don't hesitate to reach out. All right, man. Last question. What person has most impacted your thinking on how we can love orphan and vulnerable children with excellence?
Well, it's a good question. I've been thinking about this one as I've watched on your podcast, and it's a couple of different folks, really. One, honestly, it's my wife. The way that I've watched her love vulnerable children and orphans, even in our own life, has been incredible. So I think her example has softened my heart. I'm an analytical type A kind of dude, and I'm ready to just go do something. But she has softened my heart by him working through her to really have a heart that cares for those around me that are vulnerable and orphaned. Foster care, even in New Hanover County, where I live, it's something that she has shown, just the softness and the heart that she has. But then kind of thinking outside of that bubble, the talk that I went to in 2012 from Peter Greer, who's the CEO of Hope International, he has written some really good stuff on orphans and caring for them. And Jed Medifin is also a good resource as well. Love listening to him as well. So those are two guys that I don't know, but whereas I do know my wife. So yes. The three of them kind of collectively in different ways have been very helpful for me, as I've just really needed to cultivate a heart for it as well as a mind for it. So,
yep.
So, yeah.
Well, I don't know your wife, but I do know Jed and Peter, and I will tell you they're the real deal too.
Yeah.
I know that you will always love your wife more than them, so that's a good thing. So sure. She's the one you definitely need to know personally, but the other two are fantastic, real deal. What they're saying is what they're doing and what they mean. So they're actually, I think, if I remember correctly, I met Peter for the first time at the 2012. So was that the one at Saddleback?
Yeah.
Yeah. Down there so that's where I met Peter for the first time. He's become a great friend and been on the show 3 times. One of the few. Yeah. Brandon and Peter Greer. Actually, now Brandon's more, so Brandon's beating him, but that's his co-host. But actually, as guests, they hold the record. So maybe we can do that too with you. We'll see if you can push that with them. But they're great folks. So thanks again, Evans, for being a part of this. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for all that you're doing. So much appreciate it. Look forward to the day I can meet you in person. So hopefully,
thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, once again, we had a great guest. So, Brandon, I know you're the one who kind of brought Evans into the fold with for the podcast, and I'm so glad you did. What'd you think about what he had to share?
I just loved it. I mean, I love the opportunity to put flesh on these concepts. The Barna study that we've been referring to is awesome, but it represents actual people that are actually engaging. And Evans, I just feel, is one of those people that has been, we talked about humility and learning and being open to being on a journey. I mean, that's discipleship, right? All of us, you mentioned your guys' experience with the adoption process in China. I've talked a lot about how I felt God calling me to go run an orphanage. Mm-hmm. All of us, there's a starting point, but there's also a growth and a discipleship. So I just love the way that he really puts flesh onto these things. And we're on a discipleship path. We're on a growth and learning path. So yeah, just loved connecting with Evans. Just such a great guy. I don't know what stuck out to you, Phil.
Oh, I mean, all the stuff you talked about, I shared a lot of it during, honestly, I just had things that popped into my head and, thought I'd share them a little bit during the interview. So you can go back and listen to a lot of my thoughts just by going back and listening. One of the things I want to mention while we're on it, I was thinking about that when we were talking about Summit, is this was probably releasing right when Summit is happening in Cincinnati, Ohio this year. And so hopefully, if you're listening to this after, it releases, then obviously it's already passed. But if you're listening to this the day it releases and you're going to CAFO, or you're, thinking if you're in the area and you're like, oh man, I didn't even know it was happening. Well, go, you can show up and go if you're interested. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you're going to be interested in the CAFO Summit. But the other thing I want to reach, if you are there or you're going and you find us, connect with us, send us an email. I said the email earlier in the episode. It's going to be in the show notes. It's on the it's on the website. So reach out to us and say, hey, I'd love to meet you for coffee or something. If we have time, we'll make it happen. So always love doing that. Some of my good friends have come from this. Heck, Brandon's one of them, right? So have come from doing just that, reaching out on this podcast and saying, hey, I'd love to connect. And we do. And then we become good friends. It's just the way it happens. So hopefully we can do some of that. But with Evans, though, I mean, just really, I love his, we talked about that posture of humility, the posture of learning, right? Honestly, like if that's all you take away from this, that's huge. We talk about it all. That's why we do this podcast. Right. I've learned so much from the guests on this show. Hopefully you have too. I've learned so much just about, I mean, this show has humbled me in so many ways, learning things I don't know, just meeting people who are incredible. And you know what? No one even knows who they are. Right. And so those are things that I just love how Evans is talking about that idea of accountability is huge. Yes. But to ensure that we're keeping them and holding them accountable, things that are really eternal, are biblical, are not just things that we think are the right way to do it. In fact, I just had this conversation earlier today about Honduras, the organization or the community that my organization, Providence, used to oversee. And we handed it off to another organization. And are they doing things exactly how I do it? No. Does it mean those things are wrong? No. Right? It's just different. Right? There are different right ways to do things. Yes, there are some wrong ways to do things, but let's not be arrogant in thinking that we know the difference between all of that, right? Let's find out the why behind the what and have conversations about things that we have seen that, yeah, they've worked in our context. Let's find out, can it work in the other context? Is it even right for that context? So those are things that I loved, the thoughtfulness behind everything that he was talking about and the things that he was doing. I love the story of the adoption, like that's my story, right? We were expecting an adoption. Turns out we had 5 beautiful, amazing biological children, never adopted. But God has used that adoption story and journey to lead into 15 years of working with orphan and vulnerable children around the world.
Yeah,
something I probably never would have done, right? So God uses these things in ways that we often don't expect, and sometimes ways we expect that look different than we thought it would be, right? So anyway, that's something that I just really took away from that.
Yeah, no, it's awesome, man. And it's so cool. Like I've met with Evans a couple times, and some of the stuff that he just shared, I was like, I didn't even know that. I didn't know about the attempting to adopt through Russia, and just what a beautiful to see that kid get a family, and he doesn't have to leave his culture. Like it's so much better when a kid can be adopted domestically, Yep. So just so cool. So much coming out of that story. And again, just that posture is really critical. So yeah. Love the conversation with Evans.
All right, dude. So now we have Dr. Brandon. I'm calling you doctor, whatever. Is going to have a recommendation, because we got the recommendation section. So what do you got for us today?
Yeah. Doctorate, maybe someday. I'm a doctor of love or something that. Something. Yeah. Dr. Pepper.
Exactly.
Dr.
Whatever.
J. Sometimes they don't actually have to have a doctorate to be called a doctor.
That's right. Exactly.
Anyways, I got one that I have been reading, and I know you like this guy as well, because I've heard you refer to the podcast that he does, but Malcolm Gladwell, I've been reading his book, The Tipping Point, which came out some years ago, and it is a recommended read. I'm getting towards the end of it, so I'm not quite done with it, but I've loved his podcast, gotten into a couple of his books. The Tipping Point is all about how do you essentially create epidemics, social epidemics, not good ones, not the ones that we've been dealing with the last year and a half. But one of the things, and it pertains to what we were talking about today with the Barna study and with Pastor Evans and his church, we want to see change, but how do we achieve that? How can we create kind of this big social tide changing? And of course, we see society looks different now than it did 50 years ago and so forth. And some of those things are better. Some of those things might be worse. But for us that have a vision for caring for orphan and vulnerable children, when we have a heart to see kids enter family, the things that we talk about in this podcast, when we look at, wow, we have, this really big involvement from even, American Christians that just want to serve orphan and vulnerable children, but maybe need to go through some discovery, like Evans talked about. How do we actually create a shift? And Malcolm Gladwell is not a Christian or anything, but his writing is just really good. So, and it's just an enjoyable read. So, and it absolutely pertains to some of these things that we've been talking about. So, Malcolm Gladwell, The Tipping Point, he has other good books. I've read Outliers, and his podcast, Revisionist History, is a great one out there. So, Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell. That's the recommendation for this week.
It's a great book. Actually, it's interesting. His story is really interesting too. He grew up, in I believe it was a Christian home, and then he wrote a bunch of books, and then wrote the book David and Goliath. And he said he basically came back to faith. It's awesome. Came to faith through writing that book and the stories and hearing different. So it's really a cool story. I don't know him personally, never met him, but it's super, super interesting, dude. I love that book. It really reminds me, actually, as you talk about it, go back with that and listen to the interview we did with Ian Forber Pratt back early on. I think it was like 29, 30, somewhere around there. And he talked about social change and really the percentage really you need to impact and change is only about 20% of a society for it to actually be unstoppable as an idea.
I love Ian's stuff. We got to get him back on, man.
Yeah. Well, that's not his stuff. That's a Stanford study, but he talked about it, right? But Ian's great. Yeah, we do. There's a lot of people we need to get back on. I was thinking about that the other day. There's quite a few, that we definitely need. I was talking to Ruslan Malusha the other day, and we need to get him back on because he's doing some amazing stuff now in different areas, but just collaboration. He is a collaborator, and love that dude. So anyway, love that. Love Malcolm Gladwell's stuff. He writes some amazing. If you haven't read his stuff, go read it. If you're wondering what I am, I don't think you have to wonder. I'm a maven. There's no question, which is basically a connector. So if you need to connect with someone, if you want to connect with someone, I'd love to be able to do that. If I can help to be a conduit with people. That's what I love doing, to help facilitate flourishing in this world. So with that, that's what we love doing on this show. We really, really hope that what you're learning from the show, you're using it in the different areas that you're working with orphan and vulnerable children, and that you are using everything you're learning on this show and everything that we're pointing you to help you to love orphan and vulnerable children better and better each and every day. Thanks a lot. Have a great couple weeks.
We hope you've enjoyed today's Think Orphan podcast. For all the information in this week's podcast, please visit us at thinkorphan.com. You too can be part of the conversation. Send your questions to info@thinkorphan.com or join us on the Think Orphan Facebook page. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again on the next edition of Think Orphan.